How you doing, folks? Welcome back to the GM's Alcove. Got another episode for you in my series, Refighting the Battle at Tifernum from SPQR, GMT's game of the wars and battles of the Roman Republic. Fantastic game. Definitely one of my favorites. In this episode, we're going to go into some shooting. We're going to cover the Samnites' initial moves and see how they counter the advance of the Roman legions. Of course, in the last episode, we showed the advance of the legions, the use of line commands, and how all those units move forward. But we haven't seen any shooting yet, and that's what we're going to talk about in this episode. We'll even roll some dice and see what the outcomes are. Okay, folks, let's jump into the battle and see what happens. All right, the next leaders in activation, initiative order, is going to actually be two Samnite leaders. We've got Statius here with the light infantry. He's initiative 4. And Pontius back here with the Samnite cavalry. He's also initiative 4. And between those two, as the Samnite player, I'll choose Statius to go first because he wants to use a line command on the entire front line of light infantry to have them move forward and throw their javelins at the velites that are oncoming. So that's what I'd like to do. So let's get a little zoom in on this. Okay, so there we got a nice little close-up. Now, of course, here is Statius. Okay, he's stacked with a unit, as you can see. Now, the first thing we have to take a look at when you issue line commands is, are you within command range of the OC, the overall commander? Now, here's Ignatius. That first number on his counter is a 7. That is his command range. So let's see if Statius is within range. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He is not. Well, that means normally he would have to make a die roll on his strategy rating, which is at 5 in a circle with a red background. Only the overall commanders have those, or we utilize them in the battle, of a 5 or less on a D10. But there is an exception to that, and when you're playing the first turn of the battle, first turn of the game, you can ignore that requirement and instead automatically be able to use your line command even though you're out of command range of the OC, which he is. So he's going to take advantage of that and avoid having to make a die roll against Ignatius's strategy rating in order to do a line command. So he will be able to issue his line command. Now these are all light infantry, and that is going to be the makeup of this line, which the Samnites are able to do. And all of them are only one intervening empty hex between them. They have all the same orientation, and yeah, they all qualify for a line activation. So that's what they're going to do. So we're going to move these guys up and forward, and then we're going to take some shooting, and we'll get into the shooting details. Before we get started here, I should point out that firing and movement can occur at the same time. So you can have a unit that fires before they move, after they move, or during movement. However, from the point that they fire, all preceding movement has to be closer towards the target that they eventually shoot at, if they actually shoot during movement. Also, that when a unit moves into the zone of control of an enemy, they must cease all movement. That's important in this situation as well, as the light infantry Samnites will have to cease their movement for entering the zones of control of the velites, something they have to do basically to get in range of their 1-hex javelins. Now, because the velites are using what's called entry reaction fire, all the movement of the units in the line command, which is all the light infantry in the front line in this case, must finish all their movement before we actually resolve any of the shooting. Otherwise, units move on their own, they shoot, and reaction fire happens as it happens. But in this case, it all happens once all the units are finished moving. Then we resolve the fire. Now, regarding entry reaction fire, this always goes first, or is resolved first, before the actual firing of, in this case, the light infantry Samnites. So what's going to happen here is all the light infantry are going to move forward, end movement adjacent to the enemy velites, and then once all movement is done, we're going to resolve the fire from the velites first, and then the light infantry will be able to return fire. And there you go. The Samnite Light Infantry has moved forward, and I'll put a little marker there next to their line just to remind me that they all moved. You can also see Statius remained behind. He could have moved with the unit or with the line, but he chose to stay behind. And basically, here's the situation. What's going to happen is that all these velites, they have an option whenever an enemy moves adjacent to them. In this case, reaction fire. And that allows them to fire at these guys as they enter their hex. Now, since this is a line command, all movement is finished first before any shooting from either side is resolved. And if you're going to use reaction fire, because an enemy has entered your hex, it comes before any fire that the moving units are planning to make, which in this case does apply. So the timing of this, in this case, is all the units in this line, the light infantry, will move. All the units will finish moving. Next, any reaction fire will be resolved from the velites. And then after that will be any firing coming from the moving Samnites. That'll be resolved last. So let's take a look at the shooting charts and how is it resolved. Really quite simple. Each unit that fires will roll a d10, and they need a target number. And to find those target numbers, we come to the missile range and results chart. First thing we do is we look up the type of unit that's firing. In this case, foot javelins. Your velites would count as these as well. And you look at the range. Now, for javelins, foot javelins, it's really simple. They only have one range band. It's 1 hex away. That's one reason the Samnites moved adjacent. And the number they need to roll on a d10 is going to be a 5 or less. All right, so they need a 5 or less. There is some notes here. And I should mention that if you do score a 5 or less, you get a hit, and that's 1 cohesion loss suffered on the target. It's always 1 cohesion hit. There is an exception, and that's outlined here, where 2 cohesion hits result from a single missile fire that's successful, and that usually involves chariots and or elephants, so not the case in this battle. We'll ignore that. So every hit is 1 cohesion hit suffered by the target. There's some notes here, and of course we have missile die roll modifiers. You can get a good look at them, and as you can see, this one right here, if a slinger, archer, or any mounted missile unit moved or will move, they suffer a penalty of +1 when they shoot. The plus being a penalty. Remember, we need 5 or less. However, this modifier is not going to apply to our light infantry, our Samnites, and it's not going to apply for the velites either because they're foot and foot javelin. So they don't ever suffer this, even if they move or plan to move in the turn. The momentum behind the javelin is a bonus, as you can see, and the bonus is that they don't suffer a negative penalty. Also, you got other modifiers here, like shooting at skirmishers, which there are none in this battle. It's a +2 because, well, they're dispersed deployment. Another one here is firing unit is depleted. Depletion is the result of rallying after being routed. So you're a little bit less effective. You will suffer a penalty when you fire, if you're able to fire. And there's some other little modifiers there. Enough to say that what we need to do is everybody that's firing in this situation will need the same number, a 5 or less on a d10. Another thing to point out, to keep track of during the battle, is when units that are missile fire capable run out of ammo. And they could either be low missile or they could be no missile. No is where they're out, they can't fire, they have to reload. Missile low is where they have 1 shot remaining, and there's counters to represent this on units if they're missile low or missile no. And at the end of the turn, they'll have the opportunity to reload and get those missiles back. In our situation, involving the velites and the Samnite javelin, the Samnite light infantry, if they roll a 7 through 9, they are considered missile no. And if they are missile no, they have 1 more shot this turn remaining. So we mark them with a counter if they roll a 7 to 9 on their attack roll for missile fire. Yeah, so we need to pay attention to that. Okay, so let's look at this and do some dice rolling. This will be fun. First of all, the velites have reaction fire, so they get to fire first. These guys that entered their zone of control, which is their front 2 hexes. And in the case of velites, it's also their 2 flanking hexes. So let's start off with the velites. They're going to need a 5 or less all the way down the line to hit. So all these velites will resolve their shooting first. So let's roll a couple of these at least. This guy's shooting at him because he entered his zone of control. He needs a 5 or less. He gets a 5. That equates to 1 cohesion hit suffered on the light infantry. And this would go underneath like that. He's also not missile low, I should say. Next unit here, velites, firing on the same target. Again, 5 or less. He gets a 1, so he causes a cohesion hit. So I'll put a little 2 right here and take away the 1. And it'll look like that. And at this point, the Samnite Light Infantry would return fire on one of the 2 Velite units that fired upon it. And this would go on down the line as the Velites get the chance to fire first with entry reaction fire against the Samnites. So there you go. That's the results of both sides firing at one another. The Velites firing initially against the Samnite Light Infantry, and so on. There's plenty of missile low markers in there where units rolled a little bit too high in their shooting attempts. And of course, there's plenty of cohesion hits taken by both the velites and the light infantry. As you can see, the counters can kind of build up. Most of them are just to remind you. The most important, of course, are the cohesion hits. You really do need to keep track of them, and I tuck these underneath the units. The missile low or the missile no counters I usually leave on top or underneath the unit, and so you could still see the unit, because you pretty much got to see the unit. You want to be able to see facing whenever it moves. And yeah, I'll show you what that looks like in a minute here. And there they go, all straightened up. So for instance, the way I do it anyway, I like to put all those counters on the bottom unless they're really a temporary marker. I can leave them on top like movement markers. So for this guy, I've got missile low, and then any cohesion hits would go under that. He's taken 1. So I can usually judge it by the number of counters I could see on there, what's under there. Because it's always pleasing to see the artwork of the counters when we're playing the battles. And like I said, you have to know the facing whenever they move and that sort of thing. And that, incidentally, is why the Samnites are upside down in the camera view, because their facing is the top of the counters. So yeah, that is the result of shooting and how it's done. As well as that's the line command for Statius. He's basically finished. He could attempt to use momentum at this point. He has an initiative of 4, so he needs a 4 or less. All right, so with that said, it's time to resolve shock combat. Now, this is interesting. Normally what happens, heavy troop types like your legionnaires and your heavy infantry, medium infantry, basically when they move adjacent to an enemy unit, they're usually required to shock combat. And that's where these little markers, shock, must check TQ, come into play. These are marked on units that move adjacent to an enemy unit, if they're a heavy enough unit. Like I mentioned, legionnaires, heavy infantry, and so on. Light infantry are not required to be marked with this check, and thus do not have to engage in shock combat when they move adjacent to an enemy. That applies to all these light infantry, and it also applies to the velites, which are basically light infantry as well. They're not going to be marked with this counter, which means they don't have to shock combat. If these were legionnaires, these Samnites, the light infantry that move forward, because they moved adjacent, they do have to be marked with a shock, must check TQ. In other words, there has to be a melee resolution. And those little markers are put on them the instant they move within adjacent to an enemy unit that's in their zone of control. They have to attack it. But it's not the case here. None of these units have to fight in combat. However, there is another way to initiate melee or shock combat, and that has to be decided now. After all the moving and shooting is done, we go into the shock combat segment, and basically one of the first things we do is indicate if any units within the activated leader, which is Statius, within his command range, in this case 5, any of his friendly units that are within 5 command distance can be marked as shock, no TQ. And that's the other marker here, the reverse side of it actually, this counter here. Shock, no TQ check. What that means is that unit so marked is going to engage in melee combat, shock combat, but there's no TQ check necessary. You might be asking, what in the world is a TQ check? Well, that is a check against a unit's, that's 7 right there. Right there, if you could see that. That is their TQ value, 7 in this case. Troop quality. That's their cohesiveness in battle. Very important. Probably the single most important value on a counter is that number right there, the 7. When you've taken enough cohesion hits to equal your TQ, you are routed. That's how important it is. And in addition, it's all used in your TQ test. The TQ test is a D10. You need to roll equal or less than your TQ value. So when you're marked with a counter that says shock must check TQ, you basically make a TQ check. Roll D10. You have to roll under your troop quality value. If you don't have to make that check, that's what that other counter says. You just initiate combat. You don't have to worry about that. We'll get into the details of that when it applies, but it's enough to say that all these units, these Samnite units that are within his command distance of 5, can be marked with a shock no TQ check. In other words, they can engage in melee if he wants. Now, in this case, we don't want to do that. We want the velites and the light infantry to just linger about throwing javelins at one another. I don't want to provoke the velites. So that's the end of that. Now at this point, Statius has to make a decision. All right, he's not going to do any melee combat. We're past that. Now we go to the momentum phase, which is where he has to decide, am I going to attempt to use momentum to go again? Or am I just going to flip myself to the finished side and we'll move on to the next leader in initiative order? And I think he wants to attempt it. Now here's where the tricky part is. If he is successful at this, the opponent can attempt to trump it with an unfinished leader that's of higher initiative, which would be Brulianus with an initiative of 5. So there is some risk in it. So I'm going to attempt it. He needs a 4 or less. It's basically an initiative roll. He's initiative 4, so we need to score 4 or less on this die roll. No modifiers. And if he gets it, he doesn't. So he's turned over as finished. He failed his momentum attempt. Now remember, if I had rolled a 9 on this attempt to use momentum, the die roll of doom kicks in. And if we take a quick look at that, this is the table you would roll again on to see what viciousness occurs during the battle. This gives you an idea. So yeah, most of the time you're going to get this result where it's 2 to 8 and it's leader attempting momentum is finished. Go back to phase A in the turn sequence, which is basically activating the next commander. If you roll a 9, no further leader activations may occur this turn, and play goes directly to the route and reload phase. This basically ends the turn for all leaders. So anybody that hasn't gone yet can't go at all. So it's risky business because of that. A 0 to 1 reactivation is possible. Play immediately transfers to the opposing player. In this case, it would be the Romans, who may activate any one of his leaders, regardless of whether the leader is finished or not. Such reactivated leaders may not attempt momentum afterwards. So, yeah, that's pretty risky business, too. And that's why they call this the die roll of doom. More good stuff. So, that's that. We'll flip him. He is finished for the turn. All right, so with that out of the way, you can see we have the moved markers showing who moved. If they move again, that'll incur cohesion hit. That whole sort of thing. And now we're going to the next in initiative order, which would be Pontius, which is back here. He's at a 4. I should point out you can actually trump your own leaders. For instance, if this commander right here, or Ignatius himself, if he wanted to go before him, he could do that. He could attempt to trump his own commander. So there is that. But we're not going to do that. We're going to stick with this. Pontius is next, and what he's going to do, he's going to try and fill in this gap with 1 or 2 units of light cavalry, maybe put themselves within a couple 4 hexes so that he can use harassment. There's a rule in here for harassment where light cavalry, for instance, can move a distance away from a target unit, say 4 hexes in this case, and without moving, he can engage the target with missile fire and hurry up and run back again. But there's no actual movement. It's basically an individual order you give a light cavalry unit in this case, who is 4 hexes away from a target. He can attempt that as an individual order to shoot at a 1 hex range against the target. It's pretty cool. It's called Harassment and Dispersal, I believe, H&D. I can't remember exactly what it's called. But I'm probably going to do that, move a couple of these units up here, just to kind of support the first line and keep any Hastati from getting around the flank here. So let's resolve that and see what happens. All right, so there we go. Pontius basically used a line command, he can only do 1, for his cavalry. And he adjusted the positions of 1, 2, 3, 4 of the cavalry units to where they are now. He could do that. If you remember, they weren't in a line or one behind the other. They weren't in a line or one behind the other like a column. They were more like a little clump. So in order to do the line command, he had to make sure that all those that he wanted to include in the line command were within his command range of 5, which they all were. And that's how all these units ended up moving. And again, that was his first line command of the first game turn. He doesn't have to be within the command range of the general, Ignatius, way over here, who only has a command range of 7. I say only, but that's actually pretty high for a commander, at least in this battle. So this is the position they're at. These 2 light cavalry units put themselves within harassment range of this Velite, which means for an individual order, these guys can fire on this Velite from this location. And the range category they use to do so will be 1. They literally, use your imagination here, they're literally moving to adjacency with this target and moving back in one go. But we don't actually move any of the counters. It's just something they do. I'm going to use harassment with this unit. Okay, trace a path to follow, and he can resolve his fire at 1 range hex, in this case with javelins, and then assume to go all the way back. Of course, the target does get to use that reaction fire against the target who is adjacent, just like up here. He does get to do that. However, in this case, instead of shooting before the harassment unit, they shoot simultaneously. So it's a little bit different, but it's an interesting way of using, say, light cavalry in this case, to harass the enemy and run back. And there's little rules for it here and there. But that's basically the gist of it and what I would like to do with it. So what's going to happen next? There's no melee combat going to take place. There's nobody in melee or adjacent within his command distance of 5. They're all up here. Wouldn't want to do it anyway. So what he's going to do is he's going to try and make a momentum check once again to see if he can go again with these guys. And by the way, you would mark these units of cavalry as moved if they did move, and they all moved. I think the only one who didn't move was where Pontius is located, I think. Well, they all moved. If they move again, they'll be penalized with a cohesion hit. And another thing about this harassment tactic is they have to be, the light cavalry anyway, have to be faster than the target. In this case, the target, the velites are 6, the cavalry's 8, so they're going to be able to do that. Their movement points are higher. Movement rate, I should say. So, yeah. So if I'm successful with this momentum, his initiative is 4, so I need to roll 4 or less. If I'm successful with it, I'll be able to use individual commands to use harassment on them. Let's see if we can get this momentum going. Now he needs a 4 or less. He gets a 2. He's successful. He has momentum. Now he has to do something with this. You can't just roll for it and that's it. And it is important to note here that he was successful at momentum, which means opposing generals that are higher than his initiative can attempt to trump that. And I think Rulianus, who has an initiative of 5, he's down here, he's going to attempt to trump him. Now, if he's successful, he will be marked as finished. And Rulianus is now the active leader. 3. Rulianus is successful. He needed a 5 or less. Pontius has been trumped. He is flipped and cannot take any actions for the rest of the turn. But Rulianus is next. And incidentally, Rulianus has initiative 5. Once he would finish anyway, next up would be Rulianus, and this gentleman right here, whose name I cannot see, he has an initiative of 5 as well. But since he trumped, Rulianus trumped, he will definitely go next. So there you go, folks. That's the trump rule in action. I do have to say one thing, though, about the trump is if the guy trumping, making the trump attempt, in this case Rulianus, if he fails to trump Pontius, Rulianus would be flipped to finished, and he therefore doesn't get a chance to do anything. So that's the risk of trying to attempt to trump. I don't think it's wise to trump at every opportunity, just when you think it might be important to do so, or to prevent an opponent from making that killer move on your flank, for instance. In this case, I'm just basically demonstrating what's going on. I don't think I really would take the risk of trumping here, but I did, and I got it. So Rulianus is next. He gets to activate and do some stuff. So that's next. So there we go, folks. We just saw the Samnites move up, engage the Velites, the Roman Velites, and some javelin fire. We'll see what happens next. So far, pretty typical. Both armies are advancing on one another, moving forward. Light infantry are engaged, and no tricky stuff, just pretty straightforward. And we'll see what's next. Rulianus is up next with that successful trump attempt against the Samnites, and we'll see what he does with that. Probably not a whole lot. It's in the beginning stages of the battle. Nobody's really going to take any big risks, I don't think. But we'll see what happens, folks. As always, leave me some questions or feedback. If you have any questions on SPQR, shoot them to me. Let me know your thoughts on SPQR, GMT, board games, and all that. You want to see more of this stuff? Let me know. Like, share, subscribe. You know the drill. Folks, hang in there. It's only going to get better. Stay tuned. The next part is coming soon. Take care, folks.